They told her that silence was a woman's greatest virtue. They told her a duke needed a decoration, not a wife. They were wrong. In 1894, the London society papers called it the coldest match of the century. Lyra Danvers, the mute daughter of a bankrupt gambler, sold to Henry Cavendish, the ruthless Duke of Ashcroft. He vowed never to love her. She vowed never to speak. But when the walls of the empire began to crumble and enemies circled the throne, it wasn't the loud politicians or the screaming generals who saved the Duke. It was the woman who never said a word. This is the true untold story of how the silent girl brought the Ice Duke to his knees. The rain in London did not wash away the grime. It merely made the cobblestones slick and treacherous, much like the deals made inside the smoky gentlemen's clubs of St. James's. Inside White's, the air smelled of stale cigar smoke, expensive brandy, and desperation. Baron Thomas Danvers sat at a green baize table, sweat beading on his receding hairline. He had lost the manor in Kent. He had lost the townhouse in Mayfair. All he had left was a final hand of cards, and the one asset he had largely ignored for 20 years, his daughter. Across from him sat Henry Cavendish, the Duke of Ashcroft. Henry was everything Thomas was not: young, terrifyingly wealthy, and composed of steel and ice. He didn't sweat. He didn't smile. He simply watched the Baron with eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic Ocean. "The wager is simple, Danvers." Henry said, his voice a low baritone that cut through the murmur of the club. "Your debts are forgiven. The deed to your ancestral home is returned. In exchange, I require a wife, specifically your daughter Lyra." The Baron's hand trembled as he reached for his brandy. "Lyra. But, Your Grace, you must know. She is damaged. She hasn't spoken a word since she was 12. Not a sound. The doctors call it hysterical mutism. She's useless in society." Henry didn't blink. "I do not require a chatterbox to host tea parties, Baron. I require a duchess to secure the succession, and I require peace in my home. A silent wife sounds like a blessing." Thomas Danvers swallowed hard. He looked at his cards, a pair of twos. He looked at the pile of promissory notes that would send him to debtor's prison. Done. Lyra Danvers was in the library of the rented townhouse when her father told her. She was reading a worn copy of Botany of the British Isles. She didn't look up. She didn't cry. She simply turned the page. She had learned long ago that her voice held no power in this world. When her mother died of consumption, coughing blood into a lace handkerchief, while her father was at the races, Lyra had screamed for help until her throat bled. No one came. Since that day, she had locked her voice away in a chest deep within her soul. "Pack your things," her father grunted, unable to meet her eyes. "You marry Ashcroft on Tuesday. Try not to embarrass me." The wedding was a funeral in all but name. It was held in a small, draughty chapel on the outskirts of London, to avoid the press, though the society columns were already buzzing. The Ice Duke takes the silent pauper. Lyra wore her mother's wedding dress, which had been taken in clumsily by a maid. It smelled of lavender and sorrow. As she walked down the aisle, she looked at the man waiting for her. Henry Cavendish was tall, broad-shouldered, and devastatingly handsome, in a severe, sharp-edged way. He looked like a statue carved from marble, beautiful, but utterly unyielding. When the priest asked for her vows, the silence stretched out thick and suffocating. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Henry didn't flinch. He simply looked at the priest and nodded. "She consents," he said coldly. "Proceed." That night in the carriage ride to Ashcroft Manor, the silence between them was heavier than the heavy wool blankets. Henry finally spoke, not looking at her, but out the window, at the passing dark countryside. I have no interest in romance, Lyra. This is a business arrangement. You will run my household, you will provide me with an heir when the time is right, and you will stay out of my political affairs. In return, you will have protection wealth and the freedom to do whatever it is you do in silence. Do we understand each other? Lyra looked at his profile, the sharp jawline, the tension in his neck. She nodded once. Good, he said, closing his eyes. Then don't expect warmth from me. I have none left to give. Ashcroft Manor was a beast of a house, a sprawling Gothic revival structure built of grey stone that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. It sat on a cliff overlooking the sea in Cornwall, battered by winds and salt spray. It suited its master perfectly. Lyra's life fell into a lonely rhythm. The servants, led by the formidable housekeeper, Mrs. Halloway, treated her with a mixture of pity and disdain. To them, a duchess who couldn't give orders was no duchess at all. Does Her Grace wish for tea? Mrs. Halloway would ask, the heir sneering slightly. Lyra would tap the table twice for yes, once for no. She saw the eye rolls. She heard the whispers in the corridors. Paid for her like a brood mare, he did. Simple in the head, poor thing. Lyra was not simple. She was observant. In the first month, she realized that Ashcroft Manor was bleeding money, despite the Duke's wealth. The kitchen orders were inflated. The wine cellar inventory didn't match the consumption. Someone was stealing from Henry. She couldn't speak, so she wrote. She spent her nights in the small study, adjoining her bedroom, cross-referencing ledgers she had accidentally found left open. She highlighted the discrepancies in red ink. One evening, Henry returned from a week in London exhausted and smelling of railway smoke. He found the ledger on his desk. He stormed into the dining room, where Lyra was eating a solitary dinner. "What is this?" he demanded, slamming the book onto the table. The silverware rattled. "Who gave you permission to touch my private accounts?" Lyra set down her fork. She met his furious gaze calmly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small notepad and pencil she carried everywhere. "The fishmonger charges you for £50 of salmon weekly. The kitchen logs show only £20 received. Your steward, Mr. Banks, has built a new cottage in the village. I thought you should know." She slid the paper across the mahogany table. Henry read it. He frowned, his brow furrowing. He looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time since the wedding. He wasn't looking at a piece of furniture. He was assessing a potential asset. "Banks has been with my family for 30 years, Henry said, his voice dangerous. "If you are wrong, Lyra, you will have insulted a loyal man." Lyra wrote again. "Check the signature on the invoices. It's forged." The next morning, Mr. Banks was dismissed. He had been skimming nearly £2,000 a year. That evening, dinner was different. Henry didn't eat in his study as usual. He sat at the opposite end of the long dining table. "The roses in the east garden are dying," he said, abruptly cutting his steak. "The gardener says it's the soil. I'm thinking of paving it over." Lyra's head snapped up. The east garden was the only place of colour in this grey world. It was wood overgrown and beautiful. She tapped her glass with her spoon. Ding! Henry looked up. She wrote furiously and passed the note to the footman, who walked the length of the table to hand it to the Duke. "Do not pave it. The soil is too acidic. It needs lime and ash. Give me the garden. I will fix it." Henry read the note. A ghost of a smile, or perhaps just a smirk, touched his lips. "You wish to get your hands dirty, Duchess?" Lyra nodded firmly. "Very well," Henry said. "Fix the garden. But if it remains a graveyard of thorns by winter, I pave it." It was the first deal they made that didn't involve a dowry. It was the first crack in the ice. But peace at Ashcroft was fragile. Henry was a man haunted by the past. Late at night, Lyra would hear him pacing the floor above her room. Sometimes she heard him shouting in his sleep names of men lost in the colonial wars, and one name that appeared more often than others, Victoria. Lyra didn't know who Victoria was until the invitations for the Duke's annual winter ball were sent out. "We must host," Henry told her one morning, looking more tired than usual. "It is expected. All the peerage will be there, including Lord Stirling and his new wife." Mrs. Halloway, who was pouring tea, froze. Her eyes darted to Lyra with malicious glee. Lyra sensed the shift in the air. She wrote on her pad, "Who is she?" Henry read it and stiffened. He looked out the window, his jaw tightening until a muscle feathered in his cheek. "Lady Victoria Stirling," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The woman I was supposed to marry, before she decided a duke with a war injury and a gloomy castle wasn't vibrant enough for her." He turned to Lyra. "She is the most beautiful woman in England, Lyra, and she will be here to see who took her place. Do not let her see you bleed." Lyra touched her throat. She couldn't speak, but she knew something Henry didn't. Silence wasn't a weakness. It was a shield, and she would need it, because the storm was coming. The night of the winter ball. Ashcroft Manor was transformed. The gloomy stone walls were draped in velvet and silk, and chandeliers dripping with crystal banished the shadows. Yet for Lyra, the brightest lights cast the darkest shadows. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk chosen by Henry himself. It was modest, high-necked, but fitted to perfection. Around her throat sat the Ashcroft sapphires, heavy and cold. "You look adequate," Henry said when he saw her at the top of the stairs. But his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, betraying him. He offered her his arm. "Remember, do not let them see you flinch." The ballroom was a shark tank in tuxedos and taffeta. The moment the Duke and his silent Duchess entered, the music didn't stop, but the conversation did. Hundreds of eyes bored into Lyra. Then the crowd parted. Lady Victoria Stirling glided forward like a swan on a lake of oil. She was golden-haired, petite, and radiated a warmth that Lyra knew was fake. Beside her stood her husband, Lord Archibald Stirling, a man with a smile too wide for his face. "Henry," Victoria exclaimed, placing a gloved hand intimately on the Duke's arm, ignoring Lyra entirely. "We weren't sure you'd come out of your cave. And this must be—" She turned to Lyra, her blue eyes sharp as glass shards. "The little mouse I've heard so much about." Lyra curtsied, her face a mask of calm. "Does she understand English?" Victoria asked Henry, loud enough for the nearby circle to hear. A ripple of tittering laughter went through the crowd. "I heard she was simple. Can she do tricks, or does she just stare?" Henry's arm under Lyra's hand turned to granite. "She understands perfectly, Victoria. Unlike some, she simply chooses not to fill the air with meaningless noise." Victoria's smile faltered, but she leaned in closer to Lyra. "Enjoy the sapphires, darling," she whispered, her voice dropping so only Lyra could hear. "Henry gave them to me first. I left them on the nightstand when I walked out. I couldn't bear the weight of a man so broken." Lyra felt the blood drain from her face. It was a lie or a truth designed to maim. She wanted to run. Instead, she spotted a waiter dropping a tray of champagne flutes near Victoria's hem. Lyra didn't gasp. She didn't shout a warning. She simply took half a step back. Crash! The wine splattered all over Victoria's pale gold gown. The hall gasped. Victoria shrieked, Her poise shattered. Lyra looked at her, then raised a single eyebrow. It was a microscopic expression. But Henry saw it. He covered a laugh with a cough. For the rest of the evening he stayed by Lyra's side, a silent sentinel. But the night was not destined to end in triumph. Around 2:00 a.m. The guests had mostly departed. Lyra was in her room unclasping the heavy necklace when the smell hit her. Smoke. She ran into the hallway. The east wing, where Henry's private study and his war memorabilia were kept, was hazy. She banged on the doors of the servants' quarters, waking the footman, then ran toward the smoke. She found Henry, standing in the corridor, staring at the flames, licking up the drapes of the study. He wasn't moving. Henry was frozen, his eyes witty and unseeing. The crackle of the fire sounded like gunfire. The heat felt like the explosions in the Sudan. He was back in the war, trapped in the paralysis of PTSD. "Henry," his valet shouted, trying to pull him back. But the Duke was a statue. Lyra didn't hesitate. She grabbed a pitcher of water from a hallway table, soaked her shawl, and wrapped it around her head. She didn't run away from the fire. She ran past Henry into the burning room. "Her Grace." "No," the valet screamed. Inside, the heat was blistering. Lyra knew what mattered to Henry, not the money, not the art. On the desk, amidst the encroaching flames, sat a battered leather box. It contained the letters from his fallen men and the Medal of Honor he refused to wear. It was his guilt and his soul. She grabbed the box, clutching it to her chest, and turned. A beam crashed down, blocking the path. She coughed, the smoke searing her lungs. She looked through the flames and saw Henry. Seeing her in danger broke his trance. "Lyra!" The scream tore from his throat, raw and terrified. He charged through the fire, ignoring the burns, and vaulted over the fallen beam. He grabbed her, shielding her body with his own, as they crashed through the French doors onto the stone balcony, gasping for the cold night air. They lay on the cold stones, covered in soot, coughing. Henry pushed himself up, his hands shaking as he checked her for burns. "You foolish, foolish woman," he rasped, his voice cracking. "You could have died. For what? For a box." Lyra sat up, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. She shoved the leather box into his hands. Henry opened it. He saw the letters. He looked at her, stunned. He didn't say a word. He simply pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her smoke-scented hair, and held her as if she were the only solid thing in a crumbling world. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full. In the weeks following the fire, Ashcroft Manor changed. The east wing was boarded up, but the rest of the house felt warmer. Henry was different. He worked in the library with the door open. He ate breakfast with Lyra. He watched her from across the room while she read, a look of puzzled fascination on his face. One rainy Tuesday, he placed a key on the table before her. "The conservatory," he said. "I had the glass repaired. It's yours." Lyra smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that transformed her plain face into something breathtaking. Henry looked away, clearing his throat, his ears turning pink. But their fragile happiness was a threat to others. London was a nest of vipers, and Lord Archibald Stirling was the deadliest of them all. He was an ambitious man who wanted the position of First Lord of the Admiralty, a position Henry held significant influence over, despite his seclusion. The blow came on a Wednesday morning. Officers from Scotland Yard, led by Inspector Reed, a grim man known for his work in Whitechapel, arrived at the manor while they were having breakfast. "Lord Henry Cavendish, Duke of Ashcroft," Inspector Reed announced, holding up a warrant. "You are under arrest for high treason against the Crown." Lyra dropped her teacup. It shattered on the floor. Henry stood up slowly. "On what grounds?" "Selling naval schematics to the German Empire," Reed said. "We found the encrypted correspondence in your London townhouse. It is signed with your seal." "That is absurd," Henry snarled. "I bled for this empire." "Tell it to the judge, your grace. Take him." They handcuffed the Duke of Ashcroft like a common criminal. As they dragged him out, he twisted back to look at Lyra. "Lyra, do nothing," he shouted. "Go to your fathers. Stay away from this. It's a trap." And then he was gone. The newspapers tore him apart. The traitor Duke, hero, turns spy. The evidence seemed damning. A set of blueprints for the new Royal Sovereign-class battleship had been found in Berlin, and the money trail led to a shell account in Henry's name. Lyra was alone. The servants, afraid of being associated with treason, began to leave. Mrs. Halloway packed her bags, stealing the silverware as she went. "He'll hang," Mrs. Halloway spat at Lyra as she walked out. "And you'll be on the streets where you belong, you mute freak." Lyra stood in the empty hallway of the silent manor. She was terrified. Her father refused to take her in, claiming he didn't want to be tainted by the scandal. She had no allies. She had no voice. But she remembered the accounts. Lyra went to Henry's study. She didn't go to her father's house. She went to work. She knew Henry's handwriting. She knew his finances. If someone had framed him, they had to have access to his seal and his accounts. She spent 3 days and nights digging through years of paperwork. She traced the shell account mentioned in the papers. It was routed through a bank in Geneva. She couldn't speak to the bank manager. She couldn't argue in court. But she could follow the numbers. She found a discrepancy in the estate logs from 6 months prior, a payment to a locksmith for repairing the safe in the London townhouse. Henry hadn't been in London 6 months ago. He had been here with her arguing about the garden. Who had authorized the locksmith? The invoice was initialed. A.S. Archibald Sterling. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs. Sterling had broken into the townhouse, stolen the seal and planted the evidence. But she needed proof that linked Sterling to the German buyers. She remembered the winter ball. Victoria Sterling had been whispering to a man near the orchestra, a man with a thick grey moustache and a scar on his chin. Lyra had thought he was a musician, but he hadn't played an instrument. She sketched his face from memory. She needed to go to London. She needed to enter the lion's den. Lyra packed a small bag. She didn't take a carriage. She took the milk train at 4 a.m. to avoid the press. She arrived in a foggy, hostile London, a duchess with no voice and a husband in the Tower of London. She went to the one place Henry had told her never to go, the offices of the Daily Telegraph. She walked into the bustling newsroom, ignored by the shouting men in suspenders. She walked straight to the desk of Arthur Hurst, the investigative journalist who had been writing the most vicious articles about Henry. He looked up, cigar hanging from his mouth. "Who are you?" "We don't hire maids." Lyra slammed her hand on his desk. She pulled down her veil. Hurst's eyes widened. The silent Duchess. Lyra pulled out her notepad. She wrote, "I can prove he is innocent. But I need you to be my voice." Hurst looked at her, intrigued. "You have 5 minutes, Your Grace. Make them count." Lyra laid out the invoice, the sketch of the German contact, and the timeline of Henry's whereabouts. Hurst looked at the sketch. "I know this man. That's Count von Hatcher, a known German attaché. If Sterling was meeting him." Hurst whistled low. "That's the story of the decade. A lord framing a duke to steal a cabinet seat." "But," Hurst said, looking at Lyra. "Print isn't enough. Sterling is powerful. We need to catch him in the act. He's hosting a victory dinner tonight at the Savoy. He thinks he's won." Lyra wrote, "Get me in." Hurst grinned. A mute woman crashing a party at the Savoy. It's suicide. I love it. Lyra wasn't just a wife anymore. She was a soldier, and she was about to go to war for the man who had chosen her above all, even if he didn't know it yet. The Savoy Hotel was a palace of electric light and golden excess. A stark contrast to the damp cell where Henry sat awaiting his fate. The air hummed with the clinking of crystal and the murmur of the elite celebrating Lord Archibald Sterling's imminent appointment to the cabinet. Lyra stood outside the heavy oak doors of the private dining room, her heart beating like a trapped bird. She wore a severe black dress, her face hidden behind a mourning veil. She looked like a widow before the fact. Beside her, Arthur Hurst checked his pocket watch. "Inspector Reed is stationed in the service corridor," the journalist whispered. "But he won't move unless he hears a confession or sees physical proof. Sterling is too connected. You have to make him arrogant, Your Grace. You have to make him careless." Lyra nodded. She pushed open the doors. The room went silent. 30 powerful men and their wives turned to stare. At the head of the table sat Lord Sterling, a glass of brandy in his hand, flushed with victory. Lady Victoria sat beside him, looking bored. "Well, well," Sterling boomed, standing up. "The Duchess of Ashcroft, to what do we owe this silent intrusion? Has the traitor been hanged already?" Lyra walked forward, ignoring the gasps. She stopped directly in front of Sterling. She looked small, fragile, and utterly defeated. She reached into her reticule and pulled out a single white envelope. She held it out with a trembling hand. Sterling laughed, a cruel, wet sound. "A plea for mercy. Does the mouse want to beg for her husband's life?" He snatched the envelope and tore it open. Inside was not a letter, but the sketch Lyra had drawn of Count von Hatcher, the German spy. Sterling's smile vanished. His eyes darted to the guests, then back to Lyra. He crumpled the paper in his fist. "Excuse us," Sterling announced to the room, his voice tight. "Her Grace is clearly hysterical. I will escort her out." He grabbed Lyra's arm, his grip bruising, and dragged her out through the French doors onto the high balcony overlooking the Thames. He slammed the doors shut, isolating them in the cold night air. "Who gave you this?" Sterling hissed, backing her against the stone railing. "It doesn't matter. No one will believe a mute simpleton over the future First Lord of the Admiralty." Lyra shrank back, trembling. She held up her hands in surrender. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her notepad. "I have the logs. I know you forged the seal. I will trade the evidence for Henry's life. Let him go and I will burn it." Sterling read the note in the moonlight. He threw his head back and laughed. "You stupid girl. There is no trade. Henry dies. And once he's gone, I'll have you committed to an asylum. You see, I kept the seal. It's my souvenir." He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out the heavy gold signet ring, the Ashcroft ducal seal. He spun it between his fingers. "The instrument of his destruction. I think I'll keep it on my desk." He leaned in close, his breath smelling of brandy and rot. Henry was always too noble. He never understood that power belongs to those willing to slit a throat. Lyra stopped trembling. She looked at the ring. She looked at Sterling. And then she smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile, the smile of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life. She wasn't begging. She was positioning. Lyra stomped hard on Sterling's instep. He howled in pain and bent double. In that split second, Lyra didn't run away. She lunged at him. She snatched the ring from his hand and hurled it backward over her shoulder. It didn't fall into the river. It clattered loudly onto the balcony floor, rolling to a stop at a pair of polished black boots. Sterling spun around. Inspector Reed stepped out from the shadows of the alcove, Arthur Hurst right beside him, with a notepad in hand. "Lord Archibald Sterling." Reed said, his voice grim, as he picked up the stolen seal. "I believe this belongs to the Duke, and I believe you are under arrest for conspiracy and treason." Sterling's face went white. You can't." "I am a peer of the realm. She set me up. She can't even speak." "She doesn't need to speak," Hurst said, scribbling furiously. "Your confession was loud enough for the entire Savoy to hear." Sterling lunged for Lyra, his face twisted in a mask of rage. "You witch!" But before he could touch her, Reed's men swarmed him, pinning him to the ground. Lyra stood over him, smoothing her dress. She didn't look like a mouse anymore. She looked like a queen who had just checkmated a pawn. The Old Bailey was packed to the rafters. The trial of the Duke of Ashcroft was the scandal of the century. Henry sat in the dock, looking gaunt. He hadn't slept in days. He hadn't seen Lyra since the arrest. He assumed the worst, that her father had taken her away, or that she had abandoned a sinking ship. He couldn't blame her. He had brought her nothing but coldness and ruin. The Crown Prosecutor, a man named Sir Percival, was going for blood. "The evidence is clear," Percival thundered, pacing before the jury. "The seal was used. The money was transferred. The Duke is a traitor." Henry's defense counsel, a court-appointed solicitor who looked terrified, stood up. "My lord, we have argued that the Duke was framed, but we lack—" "You lack proof," Percival shouted, "and now I offer the accused a final chance." Percival turned to Henry. "Your Grace, we know you are a busy man. Perhaps you did not oversee the details of your treason. We have testimony that your wife, the Duchess, managed your accounts. She had access to the seal. She had access to the ledgers." The courtroom went silent. Henry looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Admit that you were negligent," Percival said smoothly. "Admit that your afflicted wife, perhaps in a fit of madness or manipulated by others, committed these crimes without your knowledge. Do this, and the crown will spare your life. You will lose your title, but you will live. She will be institutionalized where she belongs." It was a lifeline, a way out. Blame the silent woman who couldn't defend herself. Henry stood up. His chains rattled. He looked at the jury, then at the judge. "You ask me to trade my honor for my life?" Henry asked, his voice raspy but steady. "You ask me to condemn an innocent woman to save my own skin?" "She is a mute, your grace," Percival scoffed. "She is a burden, a cold, silent burden. Surely you do not love her." Henry gripped the railing of the dock until his knuckles turned white. "You are right," Henry said softly. The court leaned in. "I did not marry her for love. I married her for a wager." A gasp went through the gallery. "But," Henry continued, his voice rising, filling the cavernous room with the command of a general, "I have learned more about honor from her silence than I ever learned from your loud speeches. She is not a burden. She is the only pure thing in this rotten city. She is my wife, and I would rather hang 1,000 times than let a single false word be spoken against her." He looked directly at Percival. "I choose her. Do your worst." The courtroom erupted. Henry closed his eyes, accepting his death. Bang! The doors to the courtroom flew open. "Stop!" It wasn't a shout. It was a roar. But it didn't come from a lawyer. Inspector Reed marched down the center aisle holding a velvet bag. Behind him walked Arthur Hurst, and walking between them, head held high, was Lyra. She walked straight to the front of the court. She didn't look at the judge. She looked at Henry. Henry's eyes went wide. Lyra, Inspector Reed slammed the stolen seal and the signed confession of Lord Sterling onto the judge's bench. "My lord," Reed announced, "we have new evidence. The real traitor is in custody. Lord Sterling has confessed to framing the Duke." The judge picked up the seal. He read the confession. He looked at Percival, who was gaping like a fish. "Is this authenticated?" the judge asked. "Witnessed by myself and Mr. Hurst of the Telegraph," Reed said. "And secured by Her Grace, the Duchess of Ashcroft." The judge banged his gavel. "Case dismissed. Release the prisoner." The roar of the crowd was deafening, but Henry didn't hear it. The guards unlocked the dock, and he stumbled out, not toward his lawyer, but toward Lyra. They met in the middle of the chaotic courtroom. Henry looked at her, Seely looked at her, seeing the dark circles under her eyes, the soot that seemed to permanently cling to her soul, the fierce, unyielding strength in her jaw. "You came back," he whispered, disbelief in his voice. "I thought you were safe. I told you to stay safe." Lyra reached up and placed a hand on his cheek. Her thumb brushed away a tear he hadn't realized he'd shed. She pulled out her notepad, but Henry stopped her. He grabbed her hand and pressed it to his lips, kissing her palm, her wrist, her fingers ignoring the hundreds of people watching. "You don't need to write it," he choked out. I know. He swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet, burying his face in her neck. "Let's go home, Lyra. Let's go home." The spring that arrived in Cornwall that year was unlike any Henry Cavendish could remember. It was violent in its vibrancy. The grey, churning Atlantic seemed to settle into a brilliant, bruised blue, and the winds that usually stripped the cliffs bare now carried the scent of thawing earth and wildflower honey. Ashcroft Manor, too, had transformed. The soot from the fire had been scrubbed from the stones. The servants, once whispering and superstitious, now moved with a bustling, fiercely loyal energy. They walked with their heads high. After all, they served the Duchess, who had outwitted the cabinet, and the Duke, who had chosen honour over life. But inside the heart of Henry Cavendish, winter refused to break. It had been 3 months since the trial at the Old Bailey. 3 months since he had stood in the dock and prepared to die. 3 months since Lyra had walked into the lion's den and pulled him out with nothing but a sketch pad and a terrifying amount of courage. Henry sat in his newly refurbished study. The door opened to the hallway. He watched Lyra pass by. She was carrying a basket of dried lavender, her steps light, her mourning black finally replaced by a dress of soft, pale lilac. She looked like a spirit of the spring, fresh, renewed, and utterly out of place in his dark world. He watched her, and he felt a familiar, crushing weight in his chest. It was the weight of a man who knows he is holding a bird too tightly in his hands. He looked down at the documents on his desk. The ink was still wet. "It is done, Your Grace." Henry looked up. Mr. Abernathy, his family solicitor, stood by the window looking uncomfortable. "Yes," Henry said, his voice rough. "The terms are generous." "Generous." Abernathy adjusted his spectacles. "Your Grace, you are giving her the dower house in Surrey, an annual income that exceeds the allowance of a royal princess, and complete autonomy. It is unheard of for an annulment." "She saved my life, Abernathy," Henry said, standing up and walking to the window to stare at the sea. "She saved my name. I am not paying her off. I am returning the life I stole from her. And the Baron." Henry's jaw tightened. "Her father is waiting in the drawing room. He is impatient. Send him in." Henry turned to face the door. He needed to do this. He needed to cut the final cord that tethered Lyra to her past, and then he would cut the cord that tethered her to him. He was a man haunted by the screams of dying soldiers and the treachery of his own peers. Lyra was silence and peace. He would not drag her down into his shadows. The door opened, and Baron Thomas Danvers strutted in. The man had not changed. He still smelled of cheap brandy and hair oil. He looked around the opulent study with greedy, beady eyes clearly calculating the value of the paintings on the wall. "My dear Ashcroft," the Baron boomed, extending a hand that Henry did not take. "Or should I say the hero of the Empire, I told them, you know. I told everyone at the club my son-in-law is no traitor. I stood by you, Henry. You refused to take her in," Henry said quietly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "When the police took me and the mob surrounded this house, she came to you, and you closed your door." The Baron faltered, wiping sweat from his upper lip. "A misunderstanding I was, protecting her inheritance. But look now, she's a heroine, a celebrity. We can capitalize on this, Henry. I have investors interested in a memoir, The Silent Duchess. It will sell thousands." Henry walked around the desk. He moved with the predatory grace of a wolf. He stopped inches from the Baron. "There will be no memoir," Henry said. "There will be no investors, and there will be no you." He picked up a check from the desk and held it out. "This is £10,000, Henry said. The Baron's eyes bulged. It was a fortune. "Take it. Pay your debts, and then you will board a ship for America. If I ever see you in England again, if you ever write to her, if you ever try to profit from her name, I will not send the police. I will come myself." The Baron snatched the check. His greed outweighed his paternal instinct, if he ever had any. Done. She was always too quiet for my taste anyway. Unsettling girl. Good riddance. The Baron turned and scurried out the door, the check clutched to his chest. Henry closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. One monster gone. Now he had to deal with the other one. Himself. He didn't know that Lyra was standing just outside the door, hidden by the shadow of a large tapestry. She had heard everything. An hour later, Henry found her in the East Garden. It was the place where they had made their first truce, the place where she had buried her hands in the dirt and brought life back to the dead soil. Now the white roses were in full bloom, their petals stark against the grey stone of the manor walls. Lyra was sitting on a stone bench, watching the waves crash against the cliffs below. She didn't turn when she heard his boots on the gravel. She knew his step. She knew the rhythm of his breathing. Henry stopped a few feet away. He felt like an executioner. Lyra. She turned. Her eyes were clear, intelligent, and fiercely observant. She stood up, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. She reached into her pocket for her notepad, but Henry shook his head. "No," he said, his voice straining. "Don't write. Just listen. Please." She lowered her hand, her brow furrowing in confusion. She sensed the shift in him. The walls were back up. The ice had returned. Henry stepped forward and held out the thick envelope containing the legal papers. "I have spoken to the bishop." Henry began reciting the speech he had rehearsed all night, the speech that tore his heart into shreds with every word. "And to the solicitors, we have grounds for an annulment, non-consummation. It is a technicality, but it will suffice." Lyra stared at the envelope. She didn't take it. She looked up at him, her expression shifting from confusion to shock, and then to a slow, burning anger. "Your father is gone," Henry continued, unable to meet her gaze. He looked over her shoulder at the horizon. I have ensured he will never bother you again. You are wealthy in your own right now. You are free, Lyra. You can go to Paris. You can see the specialists in Vienna about your voice. You can find a man who isn't broken. He took a ragged breath. I am a man of war, Lyra. I wake up screaming. I have enemies who will never stop coming for me. I am winter. You are the spring. If you stay here, I will eventually freeze you to death. I cannot watch that happen. He thrust the papers toward her again. Take them. Please. Go and live. The silence that followed was not the peaceful silence of the library. It was the silence of a fuse burning down to powder. Lyra looked at the papers. Then she looked at Henry. She took the envelope. Henry felt a part of him die. He nodded stiffly. I have a carriage waiting to take you to the station. Mrs. Halloway has packed your trunks. He turned to walk away. He had to leave before he broke down. He had to be the ruthless Duke one last time. Slap. The sound was sharp and sudden. Henry spun around. Lyra hadn't slapped him. She had slapped the heavy envelope against the stone bench. She stood there, chest heaving, her eyes blazing with a fury he had never seen before. She didn't look like a victim. She didn't look like a mouse. She looked like a Valkyrie. She threw the envelope onto the ground into the dirt she had tilled. Then she stepped on it. Henry stared, stunned. Lyra, be reasonable. This is for your own goo. She marched up to him and shoved him, hard. Henry stumbled back a step. Lyra! She shoved him again. Her mouth was open. Her lips moving, but no sound came out. Her face contorted with the effort, her throat working against 12 years of atrophy, 12 years of fear, 12 years of locking her soul in a box to survive a father who hated her and a world that ignored her. She grabbed the lapels of his coat and shook him. She glared at him, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to tell him that he was an idiot, that she didn't want Paris, she didn't want safety. She wanted the man who had run into a fire for her. She took a deep, gasping breath. The air hit her unused vocal cords like sandpaper. You! The sound was hideous. It was a crack, a croak, a broken noise that sounded like grinding stones. But to Henry it was the loudest thing he had ever heard. He froze his eyes, widening in absolute shock. Lyra! She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands clutching his coat so tightly her knuckles were white. She fought the pain in her throat. She fought the psychological wall that told her silence was safety. You! She forced out again, the voice deeper, raspy, foreign, even to her own ears. You stupid man! Henry stopped breathing. The wind seemed to die down. The waves went quiet. The only sound in the world was the ragged breathing of the woman in front of him. Lyra opened her eyes. They were wet, but they were defiant. You decide for me. The words came in staccato bursts, separated by painful gasps. No, I decide. Henry reached up his hands, trembling, hovering near her face, but afraid to touch her as if she were an illusion that would shatter. You can speak all this time. Lyra shook her head. No, not can. She swallowed hard, wincing. Chose. I chose silence. She let go of his coat and placed her hand over his heart, feeling the frantic rhythm of it. My father. She rasped, the words flowing a little easier now, though still rough as raw iron. He sold words. Lies. Everyone. Lies. She looked deep into his eyes. I vowed never to lie. So I said, "Nothing." She stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. "Until you." Henry fell to his knees. It wasn't a choice. His legs simply gave out. The sheer magnitude of the moment, the realization that she hadn't been a passive victim but a warrior waiting for a cause, broke him. He knelt in the dirt, wrapping his arms around her waist, pressing his face into the fabric of her dress. He wept. The coldest duke of the empire. The man who had stared down firing squads and stared down treason wept like a child. "I tried to send you away," he choked out into the lavender-scented silk. "I tried to save you from me." Lyra knelt with him. She didn't care about the mud staining her new dress. She cupped his face, lifting it. She used her thumbs to wipe away the tears that trailed through the grime of the day. "I am not a victim, Henry," she whispered, her voice low and husky, vibrating with an intensity that shook him to his core. "I am your wife." She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. "The fire didn't scare me. The trial didn't scare me. Only this." "Only what?" Henry whispered. "Only silence," she said. "Without you." Henry looked at the annulment papers trampled in the mud. He looked at the woman who had defied an empire, defied her father, and defied her own trauma for him. "I love you." Henry said the words fierce and desperate. "I love you more than I have ever loved anything in this wretched life." Lyra smiled. It wasn't the polite smile of a duchess. It was a grin, mischievous, exhausted, and radiant. "Then," she rasped, tracing the line of his jaw, "be quiet and kiss me." Henry obeyed. He surged forward, capturing her lips. It was a kiss that tasted of salt tears of spring air, and of a silence that was no longer empty, but full of everything that didn't need to be said. The society papers never quite figured out what happened at Ashcroft Manor. They knew the Duke had retired from political life, preferring the rugged coast of Cornwall to the smoke of London. They knew the Duchess, once known as the Silent Pauper, had become a renowned horticulturist, her white roses famous across Europe. Rumors swirled, of course. Some said she was still mute. Others claimed she only spoke to the flowers. They were all wrong. 5 years later, on a winter evening, the library at Ashcroft Manor was not silent. A fire roared in the hearth, casting a warm, golden glow over the Persian rugs. Henry sat in his armchair, a book resting forgotten on his lap. He was watching the floor, where two small children, a boy with dark curls and a girl with stormy grey eyes, were building a fortress out of wooden blocks. "Mama, look!" the boy shouted. "The tower!" Lyra was sitting on the rug beside them. She laughed, a sound that was rich, throaty, and warm like good whiskey. "It is magnificent, Leo," she said, her voice clear now, though it would always carry that unique, husky texture that Henry worshipped. "But it needs a gate." "Why?" the girl asked. "To let the friends in," Lyra said, winking at Henry. "And keep the monsters out." Henry smiled. The shadows that used to haunt the corners of the room were gone. The ghosts of the war were silent. "Lyra," Henry said softly. She looked up, her eyes bright with love. "Yes, Henry. Read to us." The children cheered, abandoning their blocks to pile onto the sofa. Lyra picked up a worn book from the table. She sat next to Henry, leaning into his side, his arm automatically coming around her to pull her close. She opened the book. And as the snow began to fall outside, covering the world in a blanket of white quiet, the room was filled with the most beautiful sound Henry had ever known. The sound of her voice. And so the wager that began in a smoky gambling hall ended in a garden of roses. Lyra Danvers taught the world a powerful lesson. Noise does not equal power, and silence does not mean weakness. In a world screaming for attention, she found the strength to wait for the one man who would listen to her heart, not just her voice. They say history is written by the victors, but the love story of the Ashcrofts was written in the quiet moments that no historian ever saw. It was a love found not in the grand speeches, but in the courage to stay when everyone else ran away. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to hit the like button. It truly helps us share these untold tales with more people. What do you think? Is it better to have a partner who speaks beautiful words, or one who proves their love through silent action? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear more dramatic historical romances, stories of betrayal, redemption, and love that defies the odds, make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss our next story. It involves a runaway princess and a pirate with a secret. Thank you for listening, and until next time.